It's harvest time in southeastern Romania, and like this couple, thousands of small farmers are bringing in the grain the old-fashioned way. It might look like a rural idyll, but it's hard, back-breaking work, and the rewards are minimal. Most of this crop of maize will be eaten by the family themselves or fed to their animals. If they're lucky, there might be a bit over to sell for cash at the local market. With the second largest area of agricultural land in Eastern Europe, only Poland has more, and some of the most fertile soil in the whole of the continent, Romania has the potential not only to feed its own population handsomely, but also to export vast amounts of food profitably. But it's hampered by the poverty and backward methods of the peasantry and their lack of access to credit to finance modernisation. Around a third of the Romanian labour force is employed directly or indirectly in agriculture. But if Romania wants to join the European Union, those numbers are going to have to be drastically reduced. Romania's agriculture minister insists the new pro-free market government is going fast enough with reform to justify negotiations on EU membership.
Sigur că poziția noastră poate fi reconsiderată și accesul pentru accesul.
From the agricultural point of view, the arguments for Romania taking part in negotiations for eventual membership of the European Union are that in a very short space of time, Romanian agriculture has achieved a very high level of privatization. We have modernized the regulations and laws on creating a market for land. We have liberalized prices so that now they are very elastic, and we have open borders.
In some ways, Mr. Gavrilescu has inherited a poisoned chalice from his neo-communist predecessors. The overthrow of the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu in 1989 triggered off chaos in the Romanian countryside. These cattle sheds on a farm near the Black Sea coast are typical of that legacy. Ransacked and ruined, the 2,700 animals stolen or slaughtered. Such angry reprisals for the decades of repression stripped the agricultural system of much of its livestock. Then, in 1991, land reforms broke up most of the giant state farms and sent the average size of a Romanian landholding plummeting to a tiny 1.6 hectares, barely enough to support the family owning it. Such small private farms have no money for high-quality seeds and fertilizer, and 30% of them rely on horses and oxen for power. Earlier this year, tens of thousands of pigs died of starvation. Some were even being used as food for the survivors. Farmers are increasingly unable to afford feed, which has doubled in price since the beginning of the year when the farm subsidies were ended. Most of Romania's pig farms are today virtually bankrupt. The government is liquidating some of them. All these problems and more constitute formidable barriers to harmonising Romanian agriculture with the European Union. Yet they're not regarded as insuperable.
Number one issue is improving productivity and hence competitivity in the sector, which means a lot of structural changes. These are happening perhaps rather slowly, but now they're being speeded up to ensure that private farmers have access to the right kind of inputs and financing. This largely means demonopolisation.
Incredibly, this fertile country is now a net importer of food. One reason is lack of machinery. Romania's own equipment is mostly ageing and obsolete, and it's been piled up in local machinery depots and repair facilities which are virtually bankrupt. And huge irrigation systems have been more or less abandoned. The problems caused by inefficient production and distribution are made worse by corruption and bureaucracy. But probably the biggest obstacle is the bank's refusal to accept land as collateral for lending to farmers who want to modernise. That problem may eventually be solved by the creation of a market in land. The fact that you can't buy it or sell it explains why the banks won't lend on it, as a leading importer of agricultural machinery explains.
The guarantees are needed to be physical assets or fixed assets, and very few agricultural producers have enough natural fixed assets to qualify. So they therefore are asked to put up guarantees which are non-agricultural in many cases. The international loan agencies and the banks do not regard future cash flow, which is the only asset the farmer really has, as a sufficient guarantee for loans.
But the creation of a market in land to allow farmers to benefit from bank lending is only one part of a radical series of reforms being undertaken by the new government in the way agriculture is financed. The previous government of former communists tightly controlled prices paid to farmers to keep food cheap for consumers. They compensated the farmers with subsidies, but the result was a massive budget deficit. Not only that, the subsidies usually arrived after enormous bureaucratic delays, too late in the season, and jeopardised the harvest. Under the present government, subsidies have almost been abolished to comply with a loan agreement with the World Bank. Prices are being liberalised, and future government support will be redirected to private landowners. In the meantime, though, farmers have to face the immediate difficulty of buying seed, fertiliser and fuel for tractors at the higher free market prices. In many cases, the amount of land they own may be too small for them to cope with the sudden transition.
Dimensiunea medie a proprietății este 2,3 hectare.
Our land holdings are now very fragmented. The average plot is 2 to 3 hectares, and at this level it's impossible to use new machinery and technology. So the process of concentration is an absolute priority for the coming year, and the whole of our policy is directed towards this objective. These small areas are being adapted by associations, so as to be able to use machinery. Our future objective is to have commercially viable farms.
The process that's getting underway now is of small landowners forming groups, typically with a former communist Mr. Big wielding the clout at the top, to create larger farms they can mechanise. Many of the small plots are owned by people who are too old to work the land themselves, or by people who live in cities and inherited the land from its pre-communist owners. Some of the large associations are in effect reconstituting the old communist collective farms, in some cases vertically integrated with their own bakery and flour mill. There are about 3,700 legal associations, averaging between 400 and 450 hectares, and about 11,000 informal associations, usually based on families. But having got together in a potentially viable unit, they then face the problem of selling their produce through a distribution system that remains bureaucratic and inefficient.
They don't have the modern techniques of drying and storage and preparation of the grain, so you may get the grain to the market, but it actually spoils while it waits to be transshipped into the cargo bay of the ships. So it needs modern facilities, and it needs a greater volume of capacity. Romania's agriculture has stunning potential. Each year the yields improve, but if you can't get it to market, there's not much point in making the improvements further up the production line.
The new government has launched a major reform of the distribution system. Until a year ago, the state held on to the grain trade monopoly. The government plans to privatise the network, but this may be difficult because the silos have obsolete technology, unlike these modern Western ones imported by a farm owned by foreign investors. International grain companies are also coming into Romania, but they're finding it difficult to get storage. The silos at the ports are few and antiquated. Yet despite all the difficulties, there remains an eventual prospect of joining the European Union. It just might not be as soon as some other countries in Eastern Europe.
The door is open. It's not a question of feeling or of rejecting Romania. It's a question of saying, speed up your reforms, we're here to help. You're on the right track, and the door is open.
So here's a tantalising vision of the future, a large Romanian farm using state-of-the-art Western combines to harvest huge fields of sunflower seeds. Romania still has one of the most rural economies in Europe, but before it can start negotiations about accession to the European Union, it's going to have to not only make thoroughgoing structural reforms, but also bring in and enforce new legislation on sanitary and veterinary controls, food quality and safety. If Romania can do that, its agriculture could turn it into a rich country. Indeed, some Romanians suspect the French and German farmers are so worried about the competition they're blocking Romanian entry. They may have good reason to worry. In a few years' time, this country could be and should be one of the breadbaskets of Europe.